This is the story of Obadiah, the forgotten prophet, whose voice sounded like thunder to announce judgment on Edom, the nation that prided itself on its fortresses and despised its own brothers, the Israelites. Obadiah was called by God to a unique and challenging mission, to confront Edom's pride and injustice with a powerful message about the consequences of its arrogance and indifference. Obadiah was born in a dark time when the people of Israel faced a whirlwind of conflicts and pressures from all sides. Little was known about him, not who his parents were, nor whether he had an important lineage. His name spread discreetly like a shadow, and there were those who considered him an ordinary man. But there was something about Obadiah that aroused the curiosity of those who crossed his path. He was a calm young man, of few words, but he had a firm, almost prophetic look. When he spoke, even if it was a simple word or a random piece of advice, his voice rang with a wisdom that not even he himself fully understood. From a young age, Obadiah was known for moving away from the hustle and bustle of the city to spend hours in silence. He liked to climb the mountains and find places where he could be alone, feeling the wind blowing on his face and listening only to the sounds of nature around him. His friends saw him as someone strange, a boy who, despite being reserved, had an unusual compassion for others. And so, without anyone noticing, he grew at a different pace than the world around him. As the conflicts between Israel and Edom increased, Obadiah seemed to be overcome by a new and inexplicable restlessness, something that came from the depths of his soul. And then one calm dawn, as he contemplated the starry sky, a strong and unexpected vision crossed his mind. The vision was so intense that Obadiah felt his legs weaken. He closed his eyes, but the images remained, burned into his mind as if they had been drawn with fire. He saw devastated fields, ruins where cities once stood, and a darkness that seemed to suffocate the air. He couldn't understand everything those images meant, but one thing was clear. He had been called to something much bigger than himself. It was a weight that fell on his shoulders in an overwhelming way, and at the same time filled him with absolute certainty. In the following days, Obadiah hardly slept, overcome by a strange anxiety that kept him awake. He was afraid to tell anyone what he had seen, fearing they wouldn't understand him, or worse, they would take him for insane. But with each dawn, the feeling grew, like a current that he could no longer hold back. There was no doubt God had chosen him to be a prophet in a time of calamities where his voice would have to carry a difficult and painful judgment. Little by little, Obadiah realized that this mission would not just be a spiritual responsibility. It would be a test of courage. He would need to face none other than the Edomites, neighbors and distant relatives of the Israelites, but enemies for generations. He knew that Edom was a nation that lived among mountains and high valleys, proud of its security and fortifications. For Obadiah, that call became clearer every day, and at the same time, more dangerous. Obadiah could not ignore what was happening around him. Israel and Edom were like brothers in conflict, linked by ancient history, but separated by a great burden of resentment. Edom descended from Esau, Jacob's brother, but the years turned that blood bond into a bitter rivalry. They were two peoples separated by the same root, each carrying deep wounds that opened each time the other prospered or fell. And, in the middle of it all, was Obadiah, now chosen to carry a message that would leave these wounds even more exposed. He knew the Edomites were proud, confident in their natural strengths. Their land was full of cliffs and rocky mountains, almost impassable places, which gave the people of Edom a false sense of invincibility. From up there, they looked down on the lands of Israel with disdain, feeling safe and far from the difficulties they faced. Affected your neighbors. But this confidence, in God's eyes, was nothing more than presumption, and Obadiah understood, like a secret revealed in whispers, that this security would be precisely the beginning of Edom's ruin. As the prophet pondered all this, he felt the weight of the mission deepening. It was not simply a matter of speaking in God's name. He would have to face the contempt and hostility of an entire nation, a people accustomed to ignoring Israel's cries. Obadiah realized then that his journey would be lonely, that each step towards fulfilling this calling would take him further away from ordinary lives and the friendships he had. And yet, he couldn't back down. In the midst of his reflections, Obadiah saw that this feeling of isolation was part of the calling itself. His mission was not to win sympathy, but to expose the truth. He needed to tell Edom that his indifference and pride would not go unpunished, that God's justice would reach everyone, from the humblest to the most powerful. That night, as the sky closed and silence took over the mountains, Obadiah felt the divine presence in a way that made him tremble. The vision returned with frightening clarity, now more intense, and he could see the future of Edom crumble before his eyes. It wasn't just a city in ruins. There were mountains collapsing, fortresses being destroyed, hidden paths becoming traps for the very inhabitants of Edom. Obadiah understood that this was not an ordinary war or just any invasion. It was God himself declaring war against the pride of those people. As the images passed, he heard like an echo in his mind the words he was to utter. "Though you, Edom, soar like the eagle and set your nest among the stars, yet I will bring you down from there." The phrase was powerful, cutting, a sentence of no return. Edom, which was so proud of its heights and defenses, would have nowhere to hide. And this message would be up to Obadiah to deliver, even though he knew that no one was prepared to listen. The next morning, the prophet went out alone to walk around the surrounding area. As he walked down the trails, he thought about how those same rocky paths that gave Edom its position of strength would be the ones that gave Edom its position of strength, would lead its fall. It was as if the pride of the people had been imbued in those stones, which one day would testify ruin itself. Obadiah felt a mixture of fear and compassion. He knew that the judgment would be fair but merciless, and that many would suffer. He spent the night meditating, trying to find a way to prepare his heart for the weight of that message. There was a silent conflict within him, for although he understood the need for judgment, seeing the destruction of an entire nation still shook him deeply. Days later, when it was finally time for Obadiah to pronounce judgment on Edom, he stood before the people with a strange calm, as if God's own presence was holding him steady. His voice echoed across the valley as he repeated every word he had received, one after another, without hesitation. What he said first made many laugh mockingly. "Pride is your downfall, Edom. Even if you soar like an eagle, God will bring you back to the dust." The Edomites, upon hearing this, looked at one another, some laughing, others shrinking in disbelief. How could an isolated and unknown prophet challenge an entire nation, protected by its mountains and accustomed to having everything under control? To them, safety was certain, and Obadiah's words were nothing but winds that passed without effect. But he didn't stop. He continued, and his voice grew louder with each sentence, now filled with an invisible, cutting force that made it impossible for anyone to ignore him. "You trust in your riches, but thieves will come by night, and nothing will be left. You think your allies are loyal, but they will turn against you. You consider yourselves protected, but your mountains will not save you." Obadiah felt the weight of these words when he spoke them, as if each one were a stone thrown against a wall of pride and arrogance. He saw the expression on some people's faces changing from mockery to uneasiness, and he knew that, deep down, many began to fear what they were hearing. Obadiah's final words struck the people's hearts like a blow. "You watched as your brother Israel fell. You rejoiced in the suffering of your own blood. Now the same fate awaits them." There was a dense silence all around, the truth cut deeper than any blade could. Obadiah's words echoed among the Edomites, leaving an uncomfortable shadow among them. Some tried to ignore the message, but others, although silent, could not ignore the force of the accusations. The prophet had challenged them not only because of their pride, but because of their lack of compassion, because of their betrayal of the blood ties that should unite them with Israel. Edom, indeed, had not been a mere observer of Israel's misfortunes. He had rejoiced, taking advantage of the people's misfortunes and vulnerabilities as if his brother's suffering were a spectacle. Obadiah knew this bitter story well. On several occasions, when Jerusalem was attacked, Edom sided with the invaders, sacking the city and humiliating the survivors. The prophet knew that these memories were alive in the hearts of the Israelites, but for the Edomites, they were just trophies of an ancient rivalry. In one of the invasions, while Israel was fighting to defend its walls, Edom had blocked the escape routes, preventing the Israelites from escaping for their lives. There was, therefore, a deep and righteous hurt in Obadiah's message. As he recalled these events, he felt as if every word he spoke was guided by ruthless justice. God's message left no room for doubt. Edom's pride and indifference to the suffering of others had sealed his fate. What Edom did to Israel, God would return with the same intensity. In the prophet's vision, it was as if the earth itself was preparing to witness the desolation that Edom caused his brother. As the Edomites returned to their homes, many seemed restless, looking at the mountains that had made them so proud, but which now appeared threatening. The weeks that followed were silent but tense in the territory of Edom. It seemed as if nature itself was waiting, as if the mountains, the winds, and even the sun hesitated over these people who clung to pride and self-sufficiency. Obadiah, however, knew that judgment was approaching, and in a new vision, he saw how this punishment would come in a way no one expected, through those Edom trusted, its allies and war partners. Edom believed that his alliances protected him from any threat. Their relations with other nations were based on mutual interests, where everyone gained something in return. But in Obadiah's vision, he saw a betrayal about to unfold. Edom's own allies would come back against them, taking a nation that thought it was safe by surprise. Obadiah clearly saw powerful men, leaders who once shook hands with the Edomites as a sign of friendship, now turning against them with swords and torches in hand. And Edom's surprise would be bitter, because what they considered a stronghold, their alliances, their mountains, their pride, was nothing more than a sand castle ready to collapse. The prophet felt a mixture of grief and determination. He knew that every word spoken was a righteous sentence, a divine response to the arrogance that dominated Edom. However, seeing an entire people abandoned by those they trusted was a painful sight, and Obadiah understood how devastating it would be. After all, there was no greater pain than being betrayed by those in whom one trusted. The days stretched on in silence, and Obadiah, now known as the prophet of judgment, followed his solitary path, far from the eyes of the people. In his mind, the visions still replayed like vivid memories, and he carried the weight of the divine message. I knew it wasn't an easy word, but I also understood that it was the truth, naked and irrefutable. Obadiah was aware that delivering a prophecy of destruction against Edom would not make him a hero. For many, he would just be the messenger of bad news that no one wanted to hear. And still, he walked, steady. With each passing village, rumors about the prophecy spread, and Obadiah's name was pronounced with fear and distrust. Some saw him as ruthless, but those who knew his nature knew that his heart was guided by justice, not cruelty. He was merely the spokesman for a truth that Edom preferred to ignore, a truth that once spoken could never be taken back. Over time, Obadiah realized that, by talking about the end of Edom, he was not only condemning the pride of those people, but also revealing a warning to everyone around him. Neighboring nations began to hear about divine judgment, and with it came questions and fears. Could it be possible that other nations were also under God's watchful eye? Obadiah knew that, like Edom, many people believed they were safe, trusting in their wealth and military strength, without realizing that true power lay beyond any wall or treasure. Even surrounded by distrust, he persisted in his mission, certain that this was his greatest responsibility. Obadiah was like a voice that echoed in the darkness, an uncomfortable reminder that nothing escapes the divine eyes and that pride, sooner or later, brings its own ruin. Obadiah's message spread far beyond the borders of Edom, running like wildfire among the neighboring nations. Kings and generals began to hear about the lone prophet who dared to challenge an entire nation, bringing a sentence of ruin against a people who thought themselves untouchable. To many, Obadiah's boldness seemed absurd. Who was he to announce such a great catastrophe, and who would have such courage to declare that a kingdom would fall without even lifting a sword? But as the rumors spread, something deeper began to settle in the hearts of those who heard him. It was not just the news of the fall of Edom that shocked, but the idea that a judgment awaited all those who built their lives on arrogance and contempt. Distant peoples and powerful alliances began to question how safe they were. They realized, with a chill down their spine, that pride and self-sufficiency would not be enough to keep them standing if the same God who judged Edom turned his eyes on them. Obadiah's message thus became an uncomfortable shadow. His voice, which resonated from village to village, seemed to bring out the vulnerability that no one was willing to admit. Wherever he went, people watched him in silence, with expressions of apprehension, as if they saw in him a living omen that justice could reach everyone. Obadiah, in turn, moved forward, knowing that each step deepened the impact of his message. He noticed that fear was beginning to grow among those who previously thought themselves unattainable. But this did not bring him relief. It only reinforced the certainty that his path was lonely and that his task had not yet come to an end. Behind the firm words and the determined look, Obadiah carried a silent struggle in his heart. He knew that the message he brought was fair, but that did not alleviate the weight of his mission. Deep down, Obadiah had a deep compassion for those who would be judged, because he understood what it meant to be vulnerable and see everything around him fall apart. The vision of the destruction of Edom and the suffering of its people did not pass by him without leaving its mark. There were nights when, alone under the stars, he asked God to reveal whether some path to forgiveness was still possible. But the response he received was silence, a silence that seemed to affirm that Edom's pride made such compassion difficult to achieve. He realized that his task was not as easy as a rescue, but as severe as a sentence. He felt that his own faith was being tested because God's justice needed to prevail, even if his heart desired mercy. Judgment would be inevitable, and his compassion would have to wait, just as God himself would wait. Over time, this tension between justice and mercy made Obadiah an even more determined prophet. He walked, knowing that even alone, he could not deviate from the task given to him. As the years passed, Obadiah's words remained alive, echoing like a warning in the hearts of those who had witnessed his prophecy. Some said he had disappeared, that perhaps he had returned to an ordinary life, away from the crowds. But to those who had heard his message, Obadiah's name was not forgotten. His figure had become a symbol of what was right and true, a reminder that pride would never go unpunished and that God's hands would always be ready to correct the path of the people. Obadiah knew that sooner or later the ruins of Edom would fall apart, would return proof of everything he said. He did not need to be present to see it, as his mission was already accomplished. He had been the voice that exposed the truth and divine judgment, and so his legacy gained strength, remaining as a warning not only to Edom, but to all the nations that dare tread the path of pride and indifference. Obadiah's message became almost like a whisper in the wind, passing through the generations and settling into Israel's collective memory. Knowing that his role was only that of a messenger, Obadiah prepared himself for silence, for the end of his public mission. He had said everything that needed to be said, and now he waited patiently, trusting that God would complete the work he had begun through him. As the years passed, Obadiah withdrew from the spotlight, living in silence and waiting, as if his heart already knew that what he saw in his visions, it was close to being fulfilled. He retired to a simple life of prayer and observation, keeping his eyes firmly on the divine promises, trusting that in time God would bring justice to Edom and peace to the heart of Israel. Obadiah knew that God's silence did not mean forgetfulness, but a divine patience that waited for the right moment to act. Each day, he realized the weight of his mission and at the same time, the relief of having completed the task entrusted to him. When the first signs of ruin began to reach Edom, Obadiah was already far away, but the news carried by the wind confirmed what he had known since that first call. The mountains that protected the Edomites now returned witnesses of their fall, and the alliances in which they trusted were undone, like mist at dawn. In the silence of his last days, Obadiah kept his heart calm. He had been a voice, a warning to Edom and to all who dared challenge the balance that God had established. His story, told in whispers and memories, became a lesson for those who choose the path of pride and indifference. Obadiah left, knowing that his life would become an example, a memory that would cross time, bringing to the minds of those who hear his story the transforming power of judgment and humility. Obadiah left as he arrived, in silence. The little book that bears his name remains a powerful reminder, not only for those who listen to him in life, but for all who, in some way, find themselves tempted by pride and indifference. In his words, we perceive the strength of someone who, despite being simple and unknown, was called to fulfill a mission that required courage and unshakable faith. Obadiah never sought glory, but he accepted the responsibility of being the voice that would alert Edom and the world about the fate of those who choose the path of arrogance. Obadiah's lesson is clear and at the same time profound. He shows us that true power is not in mountains, riches, or alliances, but in humility and righteousness. Through his journey, we learn that pride will always be a hidden enemy, capable of corrupting and destroying even the strongest, and that God's justice does not rush, but is certain and immutable. Obadiah's example challenges us to live with compassion, avoiding the mistake of Edom, who turned his back on the suffering of his own brothers. The life of this silent and courageous prophet teaches us that even when we are just a voice in the wilderness, that voice can make a difference. Obadiah fully trusted God and delivered his message, letting the rest be fulfilled at the right time. As we remember Obadiah, we are called to reflect on our own journey, our own pride, and the compassion we offer others. If you liked the story of Obadiah and want to continue following other stories of faith and overcoming, be sure to like this video and share it with those you love. And of course, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new content. Together, let's explore more powerful lessons from the Bible.